Is it possible to build a solid, compelling apologetic for Christianity based on the most annoying and irritating aspect of humanity? What is it that drives you the most crazy about your family or friends or whatever social circles you run in? If I had to guess, it's probably the constant arguments and bickering that people tend to have with one another. And even though it tends to drive us up a wall, is it possible to extrapolate from that whether or not Christianity is true? Well, let's think about it. What do all arguments basically have in common? When they boil down, arguments are basically a discussion as to whether or not one party has wronged another. Now, there is often bickering as to whether who did who wrong, or whether there was any wrong done in the first place, or to what level blame lies. But they all rely on this idea that it's possible to determine who has transgressed this baseline of decent behavior. If it wasn't possible to determine whether a line has been crossed, then there really wouldn't be any point to arguing in the first place. Now, for example, let's take a look at the animal kingdom. When we see two dogs fighting over a piece of meat, the stronger dog will often win and take the meat with them. Or perhaps if they're feeling generous, share it with the other dogs in the pack. But what we never see is then a discussion afterwards as to whether what that dog did, whether its actions were right or wrong in any sense. They just were. But people aren't like that. Once an action has been done, we often ruminate on that and try to determine whether that action was right or wrong, whether it fell within the bounds or without of decent behavior. Ancient philosophers believed that every human being was born with the knowledge of this code of conduct, this set of decent behaviors that we expect ourselves and the people around us to follow. They noted that people seem to be bound by two separate laws, one set that we must follow, that we don't really have a choice in, and one that we should follow. We can decide whether or not we do. Now, in this first subset, you find obvious things in the laws of nature like physics, like the laws of gravity, that we don't really have an option about. If you slip and go over the side of a cliff, you don't really have an option as to whether or not you continue falling or go back up. You fall regardless of what you want to do. But let's say you're walking in the park and you notice somebody drop some money. You pick up that money and you're immediately faced with a choice. Do you return it to the person who dropped it, or do you take it and pocket it? Now, we instinctively all know what the right choice is, right? We should return the money to the person that dropped it. And we know that we believe this because when we make the decision to return it, it's because we just wanted to do the right thing. When we decide to keep it, we come up with excuses for why that was the acceptable thing to do. Now, whether those excuses are legitimate or not is beside the point. When we return it, we don't have to come up with excuses. It just was what it was. When we keep the money, we have to tell ourselves why it was okay for us to do that. Today we were down on our luck and that's exactly what we needed. Or it was such an insignificant amount of money, they would never even notice that it was gone. Or perhaps if they were in my shoes and they saw me drop money, they would do the exact same thing that I'm doing. Notice it's only when we break the law that we have to come up with reasons as to why we did it, because it makes us uncomfortable when we find ourselves outside of the bounds of decent behavior. The fact is, we recognize the law of decent behavior in ourselves and others whether we acknowledge that or not. Even if I claim not to believe in a universal code of ethics, I will still feel a great sense of injustice when a murderer is allowed to walk away free, or when a bully is allowed to victimize people with no consequences. So in the end, we end up believing what the ancient philosophers did, that there is a knowledge of this code of conduct that we expect ourselves and others to follow. But there's a second part here. Even though we recognize what we should do and we feel an urge to do that thing, we oftentimes find ourselves doing just the opposite of that. I know for myself, oftentimes when I'm faced with the choice of whether to do right or wrong, I'll feel the urging to do the right thing, but I'll still choose to do the other. I'll still choose to pocket the money when I know that the right thing to do is to give it back. I'd be willing to bet that I'm not the only person that notices that in myself. I'd be willing to bet that you notice that in yourself and in the people around you. And it's not just us that have noticed that. It's all the way down through the centuries. People have noticed that we feel an urging to do one thing. We feel an urging to do what we believe to be right. And yet we oftentimes find ourselves doing just the opposite of that. I hope you enjoyed this installment of What is Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. If you'd like to learn more about St. James or the Faith We Confess ministries, head over to thefaithweconfess.com and you can learn more about us there. If you'd like to learn more about St. James, you can head over to stjames-leesburg.org and just discover a little bit more about who we are. If you're interested in tuning in live to our services, we live stream every service on Sunday morning at 10:15 a.m. You can watch that on our Facebook page or on our YouTube channel. For more of the Faith We Confess content, feel free to head over to our YouTube channel and you can hit the subscribe button while you're there. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any thoughts or comments on things that we can do or things that we have done. We appreciate you so much, and we'll see you in the next one.